Colleagues, it's 10 o'clock, so let's make a beginning. Welcome to everyone to this, the first meeting of 2013 of the Public Audit Committee. We have apologies from Mary Scanlon, who's been sent to Serbia rather than committee. Indeed. And the first thing we have to do is welcome Bob Doris to the committee. Bob's replacing Sandra, and item 1 is to ask Bob if he has any interests he wishes to declare.
Well, thank you, Convener. It's a pleasure to sit on this committee. I have... well, the seat's comfortable and the coffee's warm, so that's a very good start. I have nothing to add on my declaration of interest other than those that are publicly available on the parliamentary website, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Doris. And item 2 is to ask the committee to decide whether we should take item 7 in private. That's to discuss our approach to the Land and Buildings Transition Tax Scotland Bill. Is the committee agreed that we take item 7 in private? Yes. Thank you very much. I should also have asked everybody to make sure their phones are switched off. That takes us to the first main item in our agenda this morning, the first of 2 briefing sessions from the Accounts Commission. And just to remind colleagues that these are briefing sessions because the best value reports into fire and rescue services and then later into police services are, of course, still local government functions, and as such the audit is carried out by the Accounts Commission, and the reports are not formally laid in the Scottish Parliament. But kindly, John Bailey, who's the chair of the Accounts Commission, has come this morning with colleagues to give us a briefing and provide the opportunity to ask some questions. He's joined for the first session by Gordon Neal, who's the Portfolio Manager for Audit Scotland for the Fire and Rescue Services Best Value Audits. And I'll ask John if he'd like to introduce the report.
Thank you, Convener. As you probably know, I'm fond of short introductions, and I suspect I speak for most people around the table. On this occasion, however, I plead some indulgence from the committee, because while I'll still be in the time allotted, it will be slightly longer than normally I would like to have. Can I say that Scotland's fire and rescue services have played, as we know, a crucial role in ensuring the safety of communities. Their remit has continued to develop, though, beyond fighting fires to include responding to road traffic collisions, flooding and civil emergencies. Our report that was published last July draws upon recent best value audits of Scotland's 8 fire and rescue services, and this report is published at an opportune time, given the forthcoming establishment of the National Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Now, the National Service will inherit many aspects of strong performance, although our work has found some marked differences in how the existing 8 services actually deliver the fire services and rescue services. Such differences are not explained entirely by local context and will present both opportunities and therefore challenges in developing the new National Service. Now, over the last decade, there's been a steady reduction in the number of fires and casualties, around 23% fewer house fires, 33% fewer casualties. Now, this is despite significant reductions in budgets and indeed despite uncertainty about the future of the service in Scotland. But these falls have not been as quick as in other parts of the United Kingdom. Levels of house fires and deaths are almost double those of England and Wales. And now, factors behind these differences are complex, and they include issues associated with deprivation, such as poor housing, high levels of smoking and alcohol abuse. But I think it's fair to say that in itself does not explain the full picture. We also found that 5 of the Scottish services are among the 6th most expensive in the United Kingdom on a cost per head basis. But I would stress that the reasons for this are not fully understood. For example, the remoteness of rural and island communities is clearly an important factor behind higher costs, but this is not the whole story. Now, nonetheless, the way that services use public money has been improving, with plenty of room for more improvement. Most notably, there's been progress in the use of the integrated risk management planning approach, providing each service with a structured approach to identifying community risks and using this to prioritise their resources. But this approach has the potential of delivering much more. For example, the deployment of fire stations and firefighters is not based enough upon an objective assessment of risk. Progress here, frankly, has been too slow. Now, we acknowledge that decisions about changing services, such as closing or merging facilities, can be very difficult. The role of elected members in the governance of fire and rescue will change with the advent of the National Service. But we did not, in general, see effective enough strategic leadership by elected members on existing fire and rescue boards. And there are important lessons about the need for a board to work in partnership with senior officers to help deliver change. We are also clear that the new service will need to find ways of engaging effectively with communities and indeed with the workforce over service change. I'd also note that we found a commendable willingness on the part of the 8 existing fire and rescue boards working with the senior fire officers to prepare their local organisations for integration within the National Service. This bodes well for the new service as it develops its approach to local engagement. And we also found that the 8 existing services tend to work in isolation with only limited collaboration among and between them. Unsurprisingly, therefore, we found striking differences across the country in how the services are managed locally. These differences covered a range of aspects, including the numbers and the locations of fire stations, the balance of resources between prevention and emergency response, how performance is measured, the roles of full-time, retained and volunteer firefighters and non-uniformed staff, crewing levels and shift patterns. And we note that the issue of retained firefighters is a particularly significant one that will need to be addressed by the new service, with every existing service having concerns about sustainability of the current system in terms of sufficient recruitment and training and retention. Differences, however, can also be seen as an opportunity for the new service. Our best value audits found much good practice and innovation, and these need to be exploited by the new National Board. Ultimately, however, I hope this report has helped to set out some of the difficult decisions that will need to be faced in the new national setup. The aim must be to retain the momentum of improvement that we found in our work. Finally, we set out in the report a range of recommendations, 42 in all, to contribute to this momentum. These are aimed particularly at those concerned with the development of the new service, but also at existing players. Convener, my colleague Gordon Neal and I will be happy to respond to any questions the committee may have.
Thanks very much. Mr Bailey, clearly this paints a picture of the fire service which the new national service will inherit. This is a legacy that they'll inherit, and although there are some positive aspects, progress, for example, in reducing the number of house fires and deaths, and it's important to acknowledge that. There were 2 striking measures of performance and productivity that you drew attention to there and do in the report, that we have the most expensive fire services in the United Kingdom, or 5 out of the 6 most expensive services, and that in spite of a reduction we still have 40% more, almost double the house fires and indeed deaths from fire that the rest of the United Kingdom have. Those are quite striking, and I wonder if you could say a little more about why you think this should be the case.
I think the auditors struggled to come to definitive reasons that would explain it. The deprivation issue is there, but then England and Wales has deprivation too. I think it's an area for further research by both by the National Board and indeed by others, because there could be, and I suspect, Convener, this is behind your question, but if we could get to the bottom of that, it could signify or suggest significant change to the approach in Scotland.
In terms of creating a new audit trail for the new audit framework for the new national service, I mean, what is the information which is lacking here, which the new service should pursue in order perhaps to shed some light on those issues?
There are several issues, but one particularly is the way in which the service in England and Wales has been funded, where there was almost an incentive to take a certain approach. Gordon, do you want to develop that in terms of the things your audits came across in terms of differences between England and Wales and ourselves, or alternatively just the ideas that are speculative at the moment rather than conjecture at the moment, rather than based on full evidence?
The one striking difference between Scotland and England and Wales was specific funding on prevention. So that was more highly funded in England and Wales, and there's some evidence that had an impact in reducing the number of fires and deaths in subsequent years. Going back, though, Chair, to your main question about the underlying reasons for significantly higher costs in Scotland and a higher number of fires, as John Bailey said, it's complex. I think there's a number of factors there, and we never really got to the bottom of it entirely. In fairness, the Fire and Rescue Service don't fully understand it themselves. I think, as John's alluded to, rurality is undoubtedly a factor, where you have to spread your resources thinly over a large area, so you're not able to reap the benefits of economies of scale. And it was telling that one of the cheapest services, one of the most cost-effective services, Lothian Borders, which happens to have a number of stations like Toll Cross that have got very high call-out rates. So in other words, you've got your economies of scale there. So rurality is undoubtedly a factor. Deprivation, I think, is undoubtedly a factor. You've got higher deprivation levels in Scotland in general compared to England and Wales. Arguably, property types as well, with a high emphasis on tenement buildings in urban areas, could be a factor. Beyond that, it's difficult to tell. You then get into sort of obscure arguments about the shape of cities. Like Dundee is a very long city bounded by the Tay, therefore you have to have a number of stations at regular intervals, as opposed to a city like, say, Edinburgh, where it tends to be more circular, where you can have much more of a number of stations in the centre which can feed out. The only other thing I would say about costs is the pattern with fire and rescue isn't unique. You tend to see that pattern with other services like education or police. So there's something clearly about, I would think, the rurality of Scotland.
I suppose my question is there information, data, which the service should be keeping, which would then be available to the auditors, which isn't there? Or is it not that? Is it just that the research hasn't been done to identify all the factors which correlate with these outcomes?
It's cost information which is available at a high level. So we're able to say Lothian Borders is less expensive than Highlands and Islands, for example. Once you start getting under the surface, though, it then becomes difficult, because the information doesn't tend to be held consistently or in a way which allows you to see how much is spent on prevention, for example, how much is spent on home fire safety visits, how much is spent on emergency response, etc. So because you don't have that information underlying it, it's then difficult to match cost to impact.
Something that you think the formation of a national service is the opportunity to correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. My question really is basing itself around the work done by locally elected members in the councils around the country. And certainly I have to own up and say I am a member also of the Justice Committee, and this was one of the things that came up. And looking at the criticism there is of locally elected members of both fire boards and police boards, and it was the lack of effectiveness in leadership and various other things that are mentioned in the report here. With the would you agree with me that perhaps the problem is, or has been, with these locally elected officials, they're actually limited what they can do, because a lot of the stuff which they were being asked to deal with in terms of the boards in which they sat was really based around operational issues, in which case they wouldn't have any great say in it. And there's a difficulty in leading something when you don't have a role in the operational side of things, and you're stuck with the stuff that comes around the edges, the pensions, the salaries, the terms, conditions, all that sort of thing. So there is that. Hopefully the National Board looking at that, they'll give the, would you agree with me that this would give the locally elected members the opportunity to actually show with the new setup and their dealings with the local police leadership that you may not quite get the same problems that we have had in the past?
I think it's fair to say that, as the report says, there's a general feeling of disappointment when we have that local boards have not been as effective at strategic leading as we would expect. Of course, they, like anyone else, has to respect the operational autonomy that falls to the Chief Fire Officer, etc., to the extent that it does. I think part of it, though, is also that it has been an officer-led service. It has been an officer-led authority almost, and that to me is down to not enough training and also not enough support to the local board locally, in terms of what they should be doing, in terms of what they would like to find out, but the resources are not there to provide them with the information. They are busy people, and provision of support, I think, is quite important. You add to that the difficulty that all members and councils have of taking a corporate view on the one side and yet looking after the ward interests on the other. And when you come to deployment of fire stations, the ward interests can be very vocal. We all, I think most of us, want a fire station that's 1 mile down the road. So it's an extremely difficult balance to achieve. So there are these issues that are there, if you like, partly to explain the councillor's position. But I do think that with better training and with more support, the local position and, of course, the national are thereby in a better position to be more effective. You could add to that poor scrutiny, but it all falls into the same general box. I don't know, Gordon, do you want to elaborate on anything I've said?
Yeah, there clearly is an issue about members not getting too involved in operational matters. And that hasn't been an issue in fire and rescue to any significant extent. The issue in general, and it is a generalisation because there's some very good elected members out there who have set the correct strategic approach. But in general, elected members haven't been involved in setting strategic direction, haven't been monitoring what's happening and matching that against what the strategic direction. Now that sounds a bit jargony. What I mean is, for example, integrated risk management planning, which sounds very jargony, but that's about trying to match resources to where the community risks are at a very high level. And there's a lot of objective evidence produced for that. Elected members in general have been slow to engage with that process and have tended not to get involved in, so that means our resources, our fire stations, our firefighters should be there rather than there, and have been slow to monitor what's subsequently happened. They've really left it to officers to get on with.
If I can carry on with that, my second question was actually based around, given what you've said, what extra help can we give the locally elected members who will be dealing with the senior fire officer? And I suppose later on we'll talk about the police, these questions would be the same. What extra help could we give them to make sure that they're able to do their job? And how do we get away from the fact of when the boards were heading down to the local senior fire officer, they were effectively working off an agenda from the fire officer, and they're supposed to do a degree of scrutiny which would be in effect dealt with by the fire officer himself. It seemed to be a bit of a roundabout. How do we avoid that reporting about and reporting to thing? How do we get around that?
I think it starts with broad questions for boards. about what is it they're trying to achieve. Have they prioritised the fire service the way that they think it should be prioritised? And of course, if there's a disagreement about that, that's a question for discussion between them and the Chief Fire Officer. Inevitably, there will be some disagreements, and that, I suggest, is quite healthy. But it's the extent to which operational issues has been the reason put forward for them not getting involved. And I think in some of these cases, just like it is, as we may see in the police board discussion, there is a tendency to take that rather passively rather than to challenge it more and to say, hang on, this is our area, this is our community, we've engaged with community, we know what the community wants, or we should know, and we've looked at the IRMP and we see where the risks are. Why are the risks not being matched with the resources? And there are quite a number of examples of that around Scotland, because fire station locations are predominantly historical in nature.
What do we do to help?
I think first of all it's getting across that general point, and then it's supplementing that with more active training, more positive training, more of it and more positive, and likewise more support. I think the support is easy to say. There's a question of funding here. How do you provide the support? But councillors are very busy people, and and we know they have to balance all sorts of issues in the air all the time in terms of time allocation. The more support on information and interpretation of information, and indeed prompting of information, and prompting of asking questions, all that would help in the way that any person sitting at the top of a particular function needs to function properly. He or she doesn't have the time to go divilling too much. So there's a clear need for support to the scrutinisers, the scrutineers, the members, in other words.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you. Can I ask Mr. Bailey, you'll be familiar with the report done by HM and Chief Inspector of Fire and Rescue Services, or Rescue Authorities rather, into the Highlands and Islands Service following your own audit Scotland, audit report. What would be your, assuming you've read it, which I'm sure you have, what would be your observations on that inspectorate report?
Well, I think just point out that Gordon Neal was part of the team that was working on that. I think it's fair to say that the momentum created by our criticism was followed through, and I think, if I can be positive, it seems to me that that particular board have taken to heart a number of the points we made, and indeed have now been followed up by that report issued in January, issued this month. It seems to me that there will clearly be a lot of local discussion about the deployment of fire stations. That was one of our major criticisms, and I refer to history, and of course in that particular region history has prevailed more than in most regions, partly to do with remoteness, ruralisation, rurality again. So I think I see it in a general way as being a positive thing. It's continuing the momentum, and I think in some ways they're pushing at a door that's now more open, perhaps now than it was, say, a year and a half ago. I don't know, Gordon, do you want to elaborate on the...
Yeah, Highlands and Islands have made significant progress on some of the core issues, the training of firefighters, so they're in a much better position in terms of workforce health and safety. In terms of catch-up on fire inspections of business and commercial premises, they've got there because of a lot of additional support from other services. So there's an issue about capacity. Once that support's withdrawn, will they be able to continue that? And the Chief Inspector's conclusion was essentially, could you keep them on life support just for a bit longer, just keep that additional support, just to embed the good work that they've managed over the last 8 months or so. The other big issue, though, is the deployment of fire stations. And we tend to talk in shorthand about closing or merging stations. It's about, are the stations in the right place? Do you have the resource where the risks are? That issue hasn't really been fully addressed yet. In fairness, I think members have gone as far as you could reasonably expect them to go in 8 months. There's been 5 stations have actually been closed, but there have been stations at the extremes, very low level. But in terms of integrated risk management planning, in terms of that thorough assessment of where the risks are and where the resources are, they haven't really grasped that yet.
And is that the case in other parts of Scotland as well?
It's not unique to Highland. I would say the Highlands and Islands is probably at one end of the spectrum, but it's a national issue.
Do you think that the kind of grasping the nettle over risk is actually because local fire boards in all parts of Scotland actually consider this by the assessment of risk being we're going to keep that fire station open? That our communities are saying, and we represent them because you made the early observations about what councillors do and how they have a corporate hat on one hand and not on the other hand. The bottom line is that they represent people who take the view that, as you said, they'd like the fire station a mile away down the road.
I think my impression, and it's an impression rather than solid evidence, but my impression is that it is more convenient to retain the status quo. Who's actually pressurising them to change and match the resources to the priorities? And what I feel as a consequence of that is that our report and then the subsequent report to which you refer have created a momentum. It's actually created, I think, more of a climate of change, more of a willingness to look at it. And the first stage is, of course, the integrated risk management process.
No, I agree that considerable progress has been made. I've been quite aware of a lot of that. But just on the kind of pan-Scotland point, the logic, therefore, for a centralisation into one national service is that you won't have that problem because it'll all be dictated from the centre, and while there'll be these local committees, the point you've been making about local elected members being very busy isn't going to change at all. They're going to sit on another local committee, which also involves ambulance, police and all the other emergency services. How is that going to improve the scrutiny of what's happening in the National Single Fire Service?
Well, I think the momentum I'm talking about is not just in relation to Highlands and Islands. There's a greater awareness of the need to apply more specifically the IRMP process. I think that in itself will help. I think the monitoring of that from central will help as well. But I do believe that a key to this is national support. Well, we can talk about that separately, but local support on a much better, thorough basis than has been the case. I do believe part of the problem here has been members simply not having the available data or indeed the available training to know where to look for the available data.
Can I just try one other area, if I may, Convener? I take all that and I'll be persuaded when I see it, if I may, Mr Bailey. The Audit Scotland report made some pretty fundamental observations around the retained firefighters, but if we didn't have retained firefighters, there wouldn't be a service in most of Scotland, and I don't just mean the part of Scotland I represent, it would be right across the board. And the key messages of your Audit Scotland report are that the Counts Commission, I keep calling you Audit Scotland, my apologies, the Counts Commission report is that the current system for retained firefighters is not, quote, sustainable. What's the alternative?
Well, it's a concern. I think there are several approaches. For example, I think, and Gordon will talk to us in a second, I believe that in England, their approach to sustainability involves higher retention salaries and the likes. And it's maybe ultimately about money. Gordon, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah. Part of the problem with attracting, there's two factors in recruiting sufficient retained firefighters. One is pay, and the other is lifestyles have changed. People tend to work in different parts of the country from where they live. So the old model of someone was at work and could respond to a call out immediately tends not to hold as much as it used to. So services increasingly, and this is a UK issue, not just Scotland, have struggled to recruit sufficient retained firefighters. South Wales, for a couple of years, have adopted a new model where it is more expensive, but there's more emphasis on the annual retainer, almost a salary, and less emphasis on call-out fees. And that model is felt to be more attractive. Some services in England have also made a bigger push on recruiting female firefighters. Again, there's 50% of the population which almost instinctively gets excluded from recruitment. So there's a number of potential solutions.
Those that the number of firefighters have reduced in those areas where they've tried these different salary mechanisms?
Yes, there's been some success in South Wales. Tayside have had a look at the model in South Wales and had started to develop some proposals to introduce it there. Now, with the National Service, that's been put on hold, but I think there's scope for the new National Service to look at that.
Guess on retained firefighters would be the new national force will have to find a new mechanism, probably both to support financially men and women who are firefighters, and at the same time the overall numbers will reduce because that's the only way in which they can afford to do it given the budgetary pressure they're going to be under.
Well, I don't know about if the numbers reduce. I mean, that would just be supposition. But they certainly need to find a new model.
Okay, thank you.
A supplementary to the causes is the unwillingness these days of employers to release people on retained fire service duties.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Beattie.
Firstly, I think the timing of this report is obviously very important given the changes that are going to take place to the fire services. I'm sure this will act as, will be interesting and compulsory reading for those that are putting together the new National Fire Service. There's 3 points I wanted to look at here. One was I was looking at paragraph 56 on page 16, and I was noting here the comment that many chief fire officers are frustrated at the lack of information shared by NHS organisations. This obviously in connection with the Data Protection Act. Is there any signs of movement on that? Is there a way through that? It seems strange that the NHS in particular have this problem when other social work and housing and police and so on don't seem to have that same restriction.
I think it's fair to say that that will be one of the things that the new board has to address, and perhaps part of the problem in the past has been dealing with 8 separate boards and eight perhaps separate interpretations of it. So I'm hopeful, but again it's hope rather than necessarily based on evidence at this stage, that something can be done there to resolve that, because it's clearly an important point.
Was it NHS across the board, or was it a particular board of the NHS?
Yeah, go on.
It was the NHS across the board. There's sensitivities on the part of NHS from releasing what they perceive to be sensitive information. Because, for example, we could be talking about an elderly person living on their own that's just been discharged from hospital, or someone suffering from mental health problems. So there's clearly concerns about releasing sensitive information to other people. So you can understand why they have the problem. There's been some initiatives in different parts of the country to try and address it. Tayside had started to inch forward in making some progress. Strathclyde had introduced, forgive me, I can't remember what it was called, but it was a community planning unit where people from different services, police, housing, social work, fire service, were located in the one building. And there was certainly some evidence that that was helping people to build up that network, those relationships, and start sharing information better. But it's a national issue.
So basically we have to wait and see what the new organisation can negotiate.
Yes.
Second point I've got is, in paragraph 59, the comment is that in 2007 Audit Scotland commented on the need for improvement of performance information. And then in paragraph 62 it says only in 2009 was actually action taken to try and establish a national performance framework, but only in recent work has progress been made in setting some common measures. It seems there's not been much focus on this, or it's not been prioritised. Would that be correct?
Yes, I would say that's a fair comment. So for us, Chief Fire Officers of Scotland had agreed a menu of performance measures, but in practice, the individual services picked from the menu as they saw fit. And in turn, some of the definitions they used were different as well. So, yeah, progress has been slow.
Actually, again, still in paragraph 62 there, it says that even when they've agreed the performance measures, the definitions are different, and that seems astonishing. It seems pretty basic.
Yep.
Okay. Could I elaborate? The Accounts Commission and Audit Scotland have been banging on about performance indicators and performance information for years and years and years. And you'll probably be familiar with the recent benchmarking project that we've been part of with COSLA and Solace for councils. I think there is generally, initially, two adverbs together, but there's an initial hesitation from those whose performance may be on show as a consequence of these indicators. Why would you be keen to do it if you can get away with not doing it? Because it's a very clear holding to account by the public. And so I think there's a general reticence around the place anyhow. But once it starts, I think people realise that this is a tool they can use for their own purposes, and indeed that's where most information should start. They should use it for their own purposes, and as it happens, then be accountable to the public for it as well. So, as I say, I think once you start the ball rolling in a particular sphere, a particular area, I think it then starts to gain momentum and becomes just a non-event in terms of doing it. So, I would encourage the new board to get underway with that and to follow through. The business of definitions is not as easy as it sounds. Yes, ultimately you agree a definition and everyone applies it. It's astonishingly difficult from what I've seen of the benchmarking project to have data that's fully clean and to have data that is collared and held on to in a consistent way up and down the country with each data set. So, but it can be done, and it should be done. You're quite right. I agree with you.
Let's hope the incoming new national organisation prioritises that. The third point really runs off that a little bit, because I was looking at paragraphs 57 and 58, and obviously, from my own area, Lothian Borders is very active in fire prevention and safety programmes, and they put a great deal of effort into it. And it's disappointing to see in paragraph 58 that there's been no robust assessments of the impact of these programmes, and it's difficult to assess whether, in fact, they're wasting their time. I suspect they're not, but there doesn't seem to be anything to back it up.
I'll offer a general point, and I think Gordon will want to come in with more specifics. There's a general point here that is this: until we get cost data, or rather until the fire services get cost data that measures spending against preventative measures and so on and so on, allocates the costs to see if it's value for money, it's very difficult for fire services properly to prioritise what they're actually doing and how much emphasis there should be on prevention. And so it's a general call that the new board really does need to get underway with proper cost data and proper measurements of spending allocated to activities. Gordon, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, we saw no evaluation of these community education projects beyond happy sheets. You know, you're on a course and you get a happy sheet, and how is it presented? That's not to say that we don't think they're worthwhile, because they're wide-ranging. They'll involve police, health people, fire and rescue, number of professions, and they're not just addressing fire and rescue issues. They're addressing much wider social issues, and their benefits are long-term. So let's not pretend it's easy to measure the impact. It's difficult, but we think it's important, if you're putting money in, if you're putting effort into something, to try and see, is it making a difference? Intuitively, as we went round, intuitively all the professionals feel they are worthwhile, they are important, and there was a worry that with budget cuts there was a risk that these types of projects might fall between stools, that as individual services were cutting their budgets, these shared initiatives would fall.
Okay. Mr. Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if I could pick you up, Mr. Bailey, in some of your opening comments about limited collaboration between the various services. Perhaps it might be a bit naive of us to assume that that collaboration will improve perfectly when we have the single force. And I'm thinking more about the relationship between the fire services and the local councils, particularly about deployment and maintenance of things like smoke alarms and local councils' approach to installing sprinkler systems in new house build. That picture is bound to still be variable throughout Scotland. So even with the single fire service, is there any work going on at the moment to try to iron out some of these inconsistencies in approach, either between the existing fire services in Scotland, and to make sure that there is more consistency of approach to these issues when the new fire service takes office in April?
I think the answer is I don't know what the new board is currently addressing as of today. I know that these inconsistencies, one region, one board with another, these are being looked at. to see what is the best way to proceed. But I think there's also a judgment having to be made about the extent to which the extent to which inconsistencies should prevail, because it fits that particular area particularly well. So these are judgments that the new board, I think, are trying to look through just now and come to some initial views on.
The introduction of a national integrated risk management plan, that'll undoubtedly help to some extent. So there'll be much more consistency nationally about the emphasis on prevention, etc., and where resources are matched to risk. But as John said, one of the costs of democracy is variability. It's up to local democratic decisions. So, for example, you mentioned sprinklers, which is a very good point. Fife decided a year, 2 years ago that in all new council builds they would fit sprinklers in every room. Now that's very expensive to do, but there is an argument that can be cost effective in the long run. But that's really for individual councils, individual housing departments to decide. Fire service can't in itself make those decisions. So it's a good question, but it's not easy to come up with a simple answer to.
I mean, your report was written in July last year, so that's 6 months ago. Obviously, I would really expect, even with the current fire services, to have addressed some, if not many, of these issues, and for there to be some evidence for us that some improvements in getting that closer collaboration, even with the existing services, has taken place. And I suppose, Convener, that's a matter we could take up with others. But one of the examples I was hoping to ask you about is about the rescue capability of the fire services, and there was a fairly well covered example from my constituency for line and rope rescue within Strathclyde, and that was the subject of various reports and reviews and inquiries and so on. Do you have any evidence that across the fire services in Scotland that particular issue has been addressed, and that there is capability across Scotland should further examples of that type occur again?
To be honest, I couldn't give you a definitive answer. I know that issue caused shockwaves throughout the fire and rescue service, and I know people were learning a lot from what happened or what didn't happen. I can't give you positive assurance that we didn't look at that in the audit.
Is this something that we could perhaps come back to you on, if it would help? If we do have any data, would it?
Well, of course it is. I mean, Convener, it's probably something for us to follow up. I mean, line and rope rescue is a major part of any of the fire services, and there were clear deficiencies there that were identified in the report. So I'm simply asking, as an elected member, having moved on from these particular incidents and your comments about limited collaboration, I would be keen as an elected member to know that the lessons have been learned and capability is available throughout Scotland for incidents such as that, should they occur.
Perhaps you could write to the committee,
Yes,
Mr. Bailey, if you're willing.
Happy to do so.
Appreciate
you.
that. Thank you.
Can I ask one?
If it's very short and a supplementary.
Very short supplementary, thank you, on Mr. Coffey's earlier point. Mr. Neil said in response to Mr. Coffey's question that resources would be matched to risk in the context of the integrated national risk plan. Does that not mean that when you do that assessment, or when our body does that assessment, resources inevitably will go to the main centres of population? Because as you said about the Tollcross station, you can always say they have more call-outs, and therefore the needs will always be greater in the assessment of risk in the centres of population. No. There's already a big fire station in Tollcross. I wouldn't have thought the data would suggest that there's a need for any others. I mean, I'm just an auditor. It's not for me to second guess what IRMP would show. The point is there's a limited amount of resource. Is it where it needs to be? There's no given that a national IRMP would draw resources from Highlands and Islands down to Central Belt. There's risks in Highlands and Islands.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Doris.
Thank you very much. Convener, could I return to the level of accidental fires in Scotland vis-à-vis the rest of the UK? I mean, that does appear worrying. Now, clearly, you've suggested some potential reasons for that. Deprivation was one. Smoking alcohol consumption was another minded. The other committee I sit on has looked at minimum pricing recently. We would hope that might tackle part of that. But what I'm keen to look at is to ask you, did you compare areas in England, say such as maybe Liverpool, that might have a similar demographic as, say, Glasgow, and do that comparison for accidental fires to see if we can start to compare like by like? Because I'm conscious you've said there's more accidental fires in Scotland, but we might not be comparing like with like. Did you attempt to do that?
To a limited extent. We had to be careful not to let this audit become a major research project. But yes, if you look at some of the areas like Liverpool or Manchester, you can see similar patterns.
So there were similar levels of accidental fires in the likes of Liverpool and Manchester compared to similar areas in Scotland. It was more of a level playing field there.
Yes.
Right. So
yes. There's been research done on that.
All right. Now, thank you. And that's quite interesting, Convener, because obviously that the differential was quite a dramatic differential, and as elected representative, I want action on that if we need to. But you're perhaps suggesting that the other reasons you were explaining well, they do suitably explain why we're at this situation, although we still have to tackle it. Can I ask then about preventative measures? Now, again, you said there was additional funds for preventative measures in England. Now, given the fact we've established that there are other reasons for the differentials between Scotland and England, are they benchmarking the quality of that additional investment in England to show whether that's getting results or not?
Yes. The reason I hesitate, I'm struggling to remember what. There's a piece of academic research that was carried out in England and Wales that showed that additional emphasis on prevention was having an impact. I couldn't give you the name of it off the top of my head, but there has been research on it.
That would be quite helpful to be kind of pointed towards that. My kind of final question, because what I'm driving towards is, well, how do we pay? Because it's all very well for any politician around this table to say, let's spend another £500,000 in preventative measures. We have to find the money. That's the challenge for all of us. So I was interested to see that different fire boards have different strategies for preventative measures. Some will use full-time firefighters, some will use retained firefighters. In Tayside, I see they use the voluntary service quite heavily. Do you have any views over which model is more effective? Because I'm just minded, it's a common sense view, but if you have a fully trained, fully skilled firefighter in someone's home, that sounds like an expensive intervention to give a fire safety assessment. Is there perhaps a more, rather than say cheaper, a more affordable and more pragmatic way of doing this?
I think part of the problem is, as I was saying earlier, sometimes it's difficult to measure the value for money because the cost of the activities are not costed in that way that enables benefit to be matched to the spending. And so that would be part of the answer as simply as a preliminary question. Is this value for money? So let's look at what's the money and what's the value. Gordon, do you want to just continue? Is there any other aspect of that you want to add to what I've said?
At the end of the day, we're just auditors. I mean, it's not for us to have a professional view, and I mean that's really for fire and rescue professionals on what's the most effective way. Instinctively, to me, the approach that Tayside and others were using and placing emphasis on volunteers, that would look to be more cost-effective. It goes broader than just the voluntary sector. There's councils like Fife, for example, which is easy for them as a unitary council, where they'll use the housing department, for example. If they happen to be going into a house, they'll do a fire safety check. So there's other models that could be used.
I think the only thing I would add, Convener, and then I'll allow my colleagues in, is if I look at page 37 of your report, Exhibit 17, that's precisely, I think, the point you were trying to establish. Tayside, and I think that's a worthwhile model, using the voluntary sector to particularly to reach hard-to-reach groups who could be most at risk. But I do know, unfortunately, that they have the highest percentage of home safety visits across all areas, but actually they saw an increase, a very, very modest, but an increase in fires, whereas other models are providing perhaps better results. So should we expect, if we look at this in 2 years' time, 4 years' time, should we be expecting to see dramatic improvement there? Is this the benchmark by which we should scrutinise this in the future?
I would say, firstly, we should expect the new board to be looking at this closely and trying to determine any anomalies or any of the reasons behind these particular trends, because that is really just a starter for 10, that presentation. It's really, why is it like that, which is of course what you're quite properly, if I may say so, asking. But that needs to be researched by the new board, and then from there proceed to the kind of improvements that you would hope for.
The point we were trying to get across in Exhibit 17, it's not so much that is the definitive way to measure, to evaluate the impact of home fire safety visits. The underlying point was, nationally the services don't evaluate them. Now, as auditors, we had to kind of think of a way of, well, what would be a reasonable assessment? And that seemed to be one way, looking at the number of home fire safety visits and then the change in the number of house fires. Tayside said, we think that's a reasonable evaluation, but actually the number of fire deaths in Tayside has come down significantly, and we think that would be a better measure. Now, I think 8 services would probably argue 9 different measures of doing this. The underlying point was the National Service needs to find a proper way of evaluating preventative work.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Doris, and thanks to Mr. Bailey and Mr. Neil. I think there's some useful pointers there for the kind of areas that when we do come to consider Auditor General audits into the new National Service, the kind of areas where we hope there might have been progress. So it's been extremely useful. We'll just pause for a moment to change witnesses. Move to consideration of the Best Value in Police Authorities and Police Forces in Scotland report. This is a joint report from the Accounts Commission, or prepared by the Accounts Commission and Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary. And so Mr. Bailey from the Accounts Commission is still with us. He's joined by Andrew Lang, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary for Scotland, and Martin Walker, who's the Assistant Director of Audit Scotland, and this is a briefing on the same basis as the previous session. We're running a little late, so I'll ask colleagues to stay focused, and we'll get through. But invite Mr. Bailey and Mr. Lang to make some introductory remarks, if they wish. Mr. Bailey.
Thank you, Convener. You'll be happy to be told that my introduction is a bit shorter than the previous one. But I'll return to my preferred format of a brief introduction. This report saw us working closely with, as you see, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, and as you see, Andrew is here to present the report with me today. It draws upon our best value audits and inspections of the 8 police authorities in Scotland that the Accounts Commission did jointly with the Inspectorate. So I'll provide some brief remarks, and as you say, Andrew will remark on the police forces. My remarks will refer to the police authorities. The background of crime rates is generally a positive one. The crime rate in Scotland is lower than in England and Wales for most types of crime, but violent crime is greater in Scotland than in England and Wales, and indeed elsewhere in Europe. Aggregate levels of reported crime have been falling, although reported levels of domestic abuse and racially aggravated crimes have both been increasing. Now, the context against was reported on our work is similar to that of the fire services, with the new National Police Force and Board being in place from April this year. The lessons from our work in relation to leadership and governance in police authorities and in fire authorities, therefore are similar. The lessons are similar. We found a mixed picture in how police authorities provided leadership and carried out their role to best effect. In general, we saw that there was much room for improvement, We did see improvements in how police authority members scrutinise their force and so hold the Chief Constable to account, but there was still, in our view, not the appropriate level of challenge, particularly relating to value for money and to risk. In aggregate, we found that members of police authorities need to have a better understanding of their roles, and it's a particular point we believe that has to be considered by all stakeholders in the new arrangements. The respective roles of the Scottish Police Authority and the Police Service of Scotland and local authorities and their partners needs to be clearly understood in accordance with principles of good governance and accountability. This will be critical as policing faces the same challenges as other parts of the public sector, with competing priorities in a time of financial stringency. Our engagement with the current police authorities since publication of the individual audit and inspection reports has been encouraging, in that the authorities have committed themselves to working towards a positive transition to the new national arrangements. And we provide in our report a checklist, Appendix 1, of issues for current police authority members to consider prior to April. We are confident that these are being acted on. Our report also sets out key issues, 24 of them in this case, on Appendix 2 for the stakeholders in the new arrangements. I hope this helps in providing the agenda to ensure a successful transition and establishment of the new arrangements. I and everyone else here, of course, will be happy to answer questions that members have. But Andrew, I think you want to say something.
Mr. Lang.
Yeah, if I could perhaps just echo one or two of John's comments. From my perspective, the reports tend to show that policing performance in Scotland is good, is strong against a range of measures. The record highs that are reported publicly in the press are hugely welcomed. The service was found to be well managed within reduced budgets against real-term costs and showed strong levels of effective leadership. Importantly, there was good evidence of focus on partnership working from the service and with many others, and local community policing was at the forefront of each force's strategic approach to its policing in its area. Equally, there was a strong commitment to matters of diversity and equality, and across the range of forces that we looked at, indeed all of them, they were meeting their statutory and legislative responsibilities and very often going beyond that. That said, there is room for improvement, primarily in better understanding the cost of policing, not the budget, but the actual cost of policing, and I'm sure you'll have heard Mr Emery talking about that over the period. And that's both in terms of the overall function of policing and indeed the constituent elements, and some of those questions that were asked around about the fire service are probably as pertinent and relevant to policing. Equally, the report shows that there is scope to improve accountability through better developed and supported governance, and that's a point which is clearly at the forefront of many of our minds at the moment.
Thank you very much, Mr Lang. There's no question, I think, that this is a very positive report in terms of performance and outcome measures, but I wanted to ask a question about one of the paragraphs which looks forward to the creation of the new single police force, paragraph 22, where the report says, "It is critical that the respective roles of the Scottish Police Authority, the Police Service of Scotland, local authorities and their partners are clearly understood, and that policing services are managed in accordance with well-established principles of good governance and accountability." You must therefore have been horrified to have watched the dispute which has broken out between the chair of the new Scottish Police Authority and the Chief Constable of the new Police Service of Scotland about exactly those lines of governance, accountability and responsibility.
I think, Convener, if you substituted interested to note for horrified, you would have my initial professional response to it, if you like. It seems to me that it's almost inevitable that there will be disagreements at the formation of this kind of new service. I think the point you're also alluding to is, of course, it's a public disagreement at this stage as well. It's one of the points we've made in the report on a few occasions, that whatever is decided has to be clear, whatever is decided about who does what and when has to be clear, it has to be unambiguous, so that there's no further scope for confusion and disagreement. That would include the role at the local level between members, councils and commanders. Again, something that I think Andrew might want to talk to at some point in terms of the pathfinders that are currently underway on this. But it does seem to us that that aspect needs some clarification, and the pathfinders will inform that. It may be that it's possible there could be different approaches for different regions of the country. Who knows? But it's the clarification is the key to it.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Lang.
Yeah, maybe if I can just offer some observation on that. I think the Best Value report actually tends to reflect HMIC's report on governance and accountability that was published 2 years ago, in saying that the system of governance and accountability within the current setup is actually good. The implementation of it, the support given to councillors to undertake the role in drawing police or chief officers to account is perhaps less well developed. And in moving forward, it was certainly envisaged that model of governance where there is a segregation between the authority and the force, and where the authority was responsible for governance and accountability and the force was responsible for direction and control, would move forward. The legislation, which I think is ample in its articulation, is capable of interpretation. And I think inevitably with a new service, new legislation, new leaders, there was always going to be challenges round about boundaries. And I think the reality is that that's what we're seeing at the moment. The challenge as we move forward, both for HMIC and ultimately the Auditor General, is to look to see a system of governance which does provide that level of segregation, which allows the service to move forward in exercising its responsibilities under the law, but brought to far better account than it has hitherto been through a professionalised board with good levels of support and ability to do analytical work and provide incisive questions on drawing the chief and indeed the force to account.
Thanks very much. Mr. Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. I think as regards the dispute, shall we say, the things appear to be moving a wee bit of a pace, and I believe that if the dispute isn't sorted out soon, the Justice Committee will be asking for a discussion on what the problems are with the two gentlemen concerned. In relation to the local service problems that you said were coming up, you seem some degree of surprise that there may be differences locally or between localities. My sort of understanding of this was it was always bound to happen that way, simply because of local needs and the fact that the boards, as will be newly constituted, shall we say, would see as their priorities. So you're always going to get that. I didn't quite understand the level of surprise in that way. In terms of the recording back and the reporting mechanisms, I'm assuming that it's just the same as the fire service.
So I didn't mean to mislead the committee. I think it's entirely possible and entirely justified that there will be local differences that respond to local needs. And I think the question really is the extent to which that happens that is justified and the extent to which it's not justified. It seems to me, frankly, that the local input, the local performance is absolutely crucial, and therefore to be effective it has to respond to community needs, which is the role of both the police and the councillors to identify. So if I express surprise, I may have overstated that aspect of it. I misled you.
Is there any, obviously we went through the question earlier on, but is there any glaring differences you see between the board setup at police and fire service, or is it identical, the problems that are going to be faced?
I think in principle they're identical. That's not the question you're asking me. You're asking about the actuality, I think, of one region with another. Maybe ask...
I should perhaps make it clear, in terms of the answers that were given earlier on about the councillors and the reporting back mechanisms and all this sort of thing, are we looking at the same problems?
In general, yes, in that there isn't the broad support that perhaps some police authorities need for their members in order to challenge effectively, scrutinise effectively, and look at the strategy that's proposed by the Chief Constable. And again, there's an officer-led tendency for the similar reasons. I don't know, I think both Andrew and Martin might want to comment further. Andrew?
Maybe if I can just set a little bit of context around about it. I suppose one of the concerns that we found through the best value reports was that a number of boards, a number of members on boards were rather parochial in their questioning when we got to some of the larger forces like Strathclyde and Lothians. The local arrangements that are emerging through the Pathfinders actually free local members up to do that, and that's a positive step forward. So rather than challenging that whole issue around about governance of finance, corporate HR, corporate strategy, local elected members will be able now to focus on what is important to the local community in discussion with the local commander and local partners. To provide some confidence around about that, whilst the local Pathfinder arrangements, the local arrangements for scrutiny are developing much under their own pace, Scottish Government are providing broad overall guidance with regards to how those develop. HMIC have commissioned a thematic inspection in January this year, which we hope will report by mid-February, to try and look at the emerging arrangements and try and provide some guidance on best principles, not on how it should be done, but on the principles it should be applied with. We're doing that in consultation with Audit Scotland to try and develop what we would describe as best value characteristics, and importantly we're doing it jointly with the Fire Service Inspectorate, so there's a shared view across both of the inspectorates and for both police and fire arrangements as we go forward. And if I can just take an opportunity to spin back a bit, there was a question earlier about fire service performance. HMIC are at a point where they have developed a range of indicators, 22 strategic indicators for policing as we move forward. We're about to merge the back office service for the fire service and police inspectorate, and will assist the fire service in developing broad strategic indicators against which the service can be measured.
Thanks, in your report, you mentioned specifically related to workforce that police support staff numbers are falling, and in the short term, the indication that they're being covered, those posts are being covered by police officers. And one of the key issues for the new police service going forward will be strategic workforce planning. Do you think for that exercise to be undertaken, do you think to have the appropriate people with appropriate skills and for cost effectiveness on the appropriate wage, that workforce planning will be helped or hindered by having a minimum number of police officers of 17,234?
It's a big question. I can understand what you're concerned about this. There is a general question, as the report says, about the sustainability of the current model, and there's a kind of backfilling going on just now that I'm sure Andrew will want to talk about more, because we were talking about it just before we came in here, and the use or the perhaps misuse of police officers in staff functions. I think it's in some ways there's a ceiling, as you say, the minimum. Sorry, not a ceiling, at the minimum level. Andrew, do you want to elaborate on this, because there's been quite a lot done on it?
Yeah, the press coverage on what we would class as reverse civilianisation, that notion that police staff are removed from the service and replaced by police officer, is pretty high profile. As recently as yesterday, there was a fair spread in the Tayside area. Maybe just to set a little bit of context, individual instances where police officers go back to fill in for vacant police staff posts have always been there. The reality is that it is a cost-effective way of short-term backfill. Very often there are police officers who are not fully fit to do frontline duties, who may be pregnant, who may have short-term injuries, and who otherwise would be out of the service, and there needs to be scope to accommodate them within the service. So it's actually, in short measure, it is a good cost-effective way of making use of valuable resources. Police officers, of course, are generic in their skills, so they can they're able to fulfil a number of roles. That said, the report draws out a very important issue, and that is as we look towards shrinking the police staff side of the business, and we inevitably will through the cost-cutting measures, is there a possibility that this will happen wholesale and long-term? And the challenge I think the report draws out for both the Scottish Police Authority and the Chief Constable is to ensure that that does not happen as a routine unless there's a valid business case to do so. Historically, it was a very simple calculation if you go back to the 80s, which was that a member of police staff was round about half the cost of a police officer. That business case is long since gone, and very often police staff come in at around the same cost, if not more, than police officers who can often undertake the jobs.
Very much. Mr. Scott.
Thank you. Can I just go back to Mr. Lang's earlier observations, very interesting observations to the committee with respect to the question the convener asked on paragraph 22, and in particular the area I know best and therefore the force I know best, which would be the Northern Constabulary. At the moment, correct me if I'm wrong, the human resources function and the finance function of that police area would be the responsibility of the Chief Constable. I'd be correct in that. And therefore, would it follow that in the new setup, the National Force Chief Constable should control, again, the human resources and finance functions of the overall Scottish Force?
If we were simply moving forward on a like-for-like basis, then yes. But the reality is, in my view, my professional view, is that the reason that that system has emerged where finance and HR sit with the Chief Constable is because policing is hugely dynamic. Quick-term decisions need to be made. They inevitably rely on human resources, human resource policy and finance being available. So under any guise, the Chief Constable will have to have that level of function. Beyond that, if you look at the Joint Police Board within Grampian, they have a finance function. It's a treasurer. But the responsibility of the treasurer is not to do the day-to-day running of the finance for the police. It's to provide the board with the relevant information and challenge that they can then draw the chief to account on. And that's exactly how I think the system was determined to be. In terms of HR, it's slightly different, but we have to bear in mind that the new Scottish Police Authority, with the back office that comes with it, has a significant resource. It has a significant number of people. So there is a human resource element to that, and actually just factoring the responsibilities of the authority. The current debate and discussion that's going on is to what extent does that function, or do both those functions provide direction and control over the resource. So there's, I guess, in simplifying that, the force needs a human resource function and a finance function. The authority needs it, but the question in terms of governance is, does the Scottish Police Authority want to hold the Chief Constable to account for those elements, or does the Scottish Police Authority actually want to have much more direction and control on it? In my evidence to the Justice Committee, I made what I thought was a reasonably clear statement, and that is the legislation allows both. And I don't think there's any difficulty in interpreting that. If you go to Section 4 in the legislation, it basically gives an opportunity for the Scottish Police Authority to set up memorandums of understanding, schemes of delegation, schemes of administration that will allow and facilitate the efficient running of policing. And I think that exists. The challenge then is how much do the board want to retain responsibility for governance and accountability, and how much do they want to exercise direction and control? If it's the latter, somebody else independent must exercise the governance and accountability. There needs to be clear segregation. In reality, that I think will fall back to HMIC, the Auditor General, and ultimately the Justice Committee. I'm not sure it was designed to do that, but certainly the legislation allows that interpretation.
It's very, very helpful. So let me just get this absolutely straight. Your assessment of what's currently going on is that your own office, Audit Scotland in the future, and Parliament will have to be responsible for accountability and questioning and scrutiny, because the board that's being set up is simply going to seek to control aspects of the Chief Constable's work?
It's very close. I think what I'm really saying is that there is a spectrum. At one end sits governance and accountability, at the other end sits direction and control. The further apart those are in terms of audit and scrutiny, the better. That segregation is an important factor, and it's a factor we've always seen within policing and police authorities. The more the board tends towards direction and control, the less they can legitimately hold themselves to account. Somebody else would have to do it. And my view would be the more the board veers towards direction and control, the more locus and the more intrusion will have to come from, through Audit Scotland, from the Auditor General, from myself, and from, I would suspect, Parliament through the Justice Committee.
I ask that question because this is a public audit committee, so therefore through Audit Scotland we have a very clear interest in where that balance will be reached on the spectrum you've very interestingly described. The other one I was going to ask, if I may, Convener, is on, again, Mr Lang's earlier point about local members. It would be fair to say in the new setup, is it not, that while local members will sit on some kind of local committee that is yet to be exactly prescribed in different parts of the 32 local authorities across Scotland, they won't have any say over the budget other than to say, yes, sir?
There's a requirement under legislation for them to agree the local policing plan, but in terms of resource and finance, no. There has to be recourse. The recourse comes naturally through default, either a negotiation with the local commander, failing which an escalation to the assistant chief, potentially a deputy and the chief, but there's always direct access back to the Scottish Police Authority. So that level of negotiation can continue to happen, but they have no direction over the budget setting.
And therefore, thank you, and therefore in the context again of your earlier answer in respect of the Parliament's responsibilities and this committee's responsibilities, do you envisage there being more, as it were, challenge function in what this committee and indeed the Justice Committee of Parliament would seek to do in the future, because there'll be no effective financial oversight, well there'll be oversight, but there won't be any direction, as you say, by local authorities, by 32 local authorities across Scotland?
No, and part of, I think the answer to that in simple terms is yes, there needs to be an interest by Parliament. I think if good governance and accountability sits into place, we're working to nationally set priorities. The Scottish Police Authority will set a plan, the Chief Constable will set a plan, those plans will be expended into the local command areas, local authority. In fact, Chief Constable House has said each ward area in Scotland will have a local plan that's agreed.
He said that.
Except for the islands.
As an islander, I noticed carefully.
And so that linear progression, if you like, should suggest that we are doing the appropriate things and appropriate priorities nationally, but within a local context. And I think there's real opportunity through the local committees for locally elected members to influence and shape just how those priorities are focused on locally. But in terms, and I guess it's a complicated answer, in terms of the involvement of the Scottish Parliament in overseeing the budget and the proper distribution and whether it's right and proper, two things need to happen. We need to have a really good system of governance and accountability. Comes back to the first point as to whether the Scottish Police Authority will be an authority of direction and control or governance and accountability. And secondly, there needs to be that feedback from local areas to say, yeah, we're broadly happy with what's happening, or actually we think our resource distribution has been distorted. HMIC, again, if I come back into our role, will provide profiles across the 32 local authority areas. The performance measures that we are developing are designed to be done across the 32 local authority areas. There's a level of benchmarking within that. That information will be fed to the Scottish Police Authority and will be available to the Parliament and to other committees.
Thank you very much. It's very useful.
Thank you, Mr Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. Overall, the report's quite a positive one. Being the Audit Committee, of course, we've got to look for the bits to pick at. I'm looking at special constables, which is paragraphs 113 to 15. Although it seems that the number of special constables hasn't really fluctuated out of a band that's been at for quite a number of years, there's obviously a lot of variations within the forces for that. And what seems clear is the number of hours that these people are working has hugely increased. Now, correctly in paragraph 115, there's reference to the European Working Time Directive and how that might impact on this. Special constables are also clearly an effective resource to use because, from the point of view of the police authorities, they're cheaper. However, the number of hours that they seem to be working, which seems in some cases to have doubled, seems quite an ask for people that generally have an existing job and so on. How is that effectively working? How is that being managed?
In your court, I think?
Yeah, a couple of issues round about this. The arrangements for employment, if I can use the term, of special constable changed over the past 5 years, whereby historically special constables were recruited. They were recruited on a voluntary basis to receive no remuneration. At that time, it would probably be fair to say that the number of special constables was higher, but the number of hours that they did and the commitment that they gave was perhaps on occasions lower. Changes to that came in round about, I think, 4.5, 5 years ago, where there was a fixed payment available to special constables over a period. And at the same time, there was a level of review taken round about the training of special constables. They need to be trained up fully. They are hugely valuable. And while they are a cheaper resource, they're a very, very effective resource. They can do all of the functions of a constable. And so over the period, what we've seen is a smaller number of people who are much more skilled and trained. And that, I guess the return on investment is that is to make sure that when you're putting a significant level of training into an individual, that you get some return for it. The challenge round about it is indeed the working time directives and forces across the country are involved in monitoring the time that's spent by special constables and looking at it against the backdrop of their other employment. Does that answer all of it, or have I missed a section?
Well, I think I'm interested in also seeing where this is going, where the pattern is for the future, because the trend we're seeing so far is perhaps a little bit less numbers of special constables, considerably less in some forces, but a huge increase in the number of hours. I mean, where is this heading? Is there any sign that that's tailing off?
No, I don't think so. So the bit that I did miss was the more recent advent that we've seen with special constables is that very, very many police officers who are looking, or people who are looking to become police officers, will first step into the special constabulary. And that's a change from the past trend where you had many special constables who came in to be special constables for, if you like, a part-time career. So what we see now is people applying for the police are encouraged to become special constable first, or alternatively, if they are unsuccessful at their first interview, are then encouraged to go on and become special constables. They'll do a couple of years, that training will be drawn in, and they'll then be taken into the service. That's the pattern and the strategic approach that I think will continue to be taken. But my understanding is that there will continue to be a huge emphasis on trying to recruit to the special constabulary over the period ahead.
So what sort of percentage are there? There's 1,443 special constables as of March. What sort of percentage of that would be people who have joined the special constabulary with a view to joining the regular police force? In other words, where it's a sort of training ground as much as anything else?
If I was being entirely honest, I couldn't put a figure on it. I can come back to you with a figure, but there is more and more encouragement by the service for people to do that. And not simply to say we will get somebody on a voluntary basis that we don't have to pay, but much more predominantly to say, come and test it. You really don't know what policing's like until you've come in and tested it. And so there's a real opportunity for people to come in, to have that opportunity to see and experience what a police officer does, and then choose whether it's the right lifestyle for them.
It makes sense. I'd be interested in knowing what sort of proportion of that was in that category.
Write to us with that, Mr. Lang. Thank you, appreciate it. Mr. Dornan.
It's a question for Mr. Bailey. In the course of doing these two reports, did you see any discernible difference between the police service, fire service, and things like partnership working and shared service, the way that they approached it? And if so, did you see anything that the national services could learn from?
Both services try very hard to work with their partners in that area, and there's lots of evidence for that. I would see that continuing and indeed strengthening as the new service comes into play. Martin, I don't know if you want to embellish that general point.
I think part of the story here is the consistent message is difference, if that makes sense. In that we didn't see the same kind of thing in all areas, but there was different approaches to partnership, project working, that kind of stuff, and you would see different things in different places, which probably sort of reflects back on some of the early discussion that we've had around what works in a particular area might not necessarily be fit for purpose in others. What we tended to find, though, was that a lot of that partnership working, the positive aspects were around the commitment that there was there. There was involvement in community planning partnerships and groups and projects, that kind of stuff. I think one of the things that we didn't find a lot of was to do with more formal partnership arrangements, which ties into one of the early discussions around, couldn't you have just one HR function that covered all forces, for example? So in terms of those kind of shared backroom services, that more formal partnership, there wasn't a huge amount of that. But what we did find is in terms of on-the-ground stuff, in terms of projects, people working together, there was a pretty good pattern across the piece of partnership in some shape or form in all the areas that we visited.
Can I just ask further to that then? Did you find that that was strongest in certain, where it was strong in an area, it was strong for both the police and the fire service in that area, or was it uniformly strong across the country?
I didn't cover the fire stuff, I did the police stuff, so I think it's probably a little bit difficult to comment on that. I mean, I do know from our other audit work that where in an area or in organisations there is a kind of culture of partnership working, that tends to permeate across all of those, because by definition, if we're looking at a council and they are doing good partnership working, they have to be doing that good partnership working with somebody else, and typically that involves the likes of the police and the fire and so on. I mean, I think probably, you know, picking up on a couple of examples, particularly good examples in the Highlands actually, when we did audit work up there, because of the nature of the area, because of the nature of the people, because of the nature of the localities, it's almost just part of the fabric of society that people do that because they know each other, all those kind of things. So you would tend to find quite good on-the-ground partnership working, even though, as I say, you wouldn't necessarily find that reflected in more formal structures in you know, sort of a more formal setting. So, you know, it varies, but we did find that generally partnership working was something that was much more commonplace and was become part of the culture right across the piece.
Can I just supplement in terms of the fire service? I think that it's fair to say we did not detect any difference in the willingness of either service to participate in partnership type approaches to sharing information that they could and to working together on projects. There's just the same amount of willingness to work within the family, if you like.
Difference in the effectiveness?
That I don't. The honest answer is that I don't know, because often they were working in the same partnerships, and it's difficult to measure.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Sorry for putting you in the spot for the fire service.
Thank you, Mr. Dornan. Mr. Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think it's this report that I've seen today, it's probably one of the best reports I've seen as a member of this audit committee for a number of years. And I think we really have to put on record our congratulations to the police force for delivering the service that they are to Scotland's public. Across a whole range of indicators, there's improvements across the board, and I'm glad to state that. I wanted to return to the issue of accountability, scrutiny and the role of elected members, our local councillors. There's been some comment in the report about some poor levels of engagement between their local councillors and their scrutiny role. And whilst training needs have been identified, and I do know that there are significant training programmes going on in local authorities, surely the scrutiny role is also predicated by quality information that's given to local elected members. And I note, Mr Bailey, in paragraph 49, that you have noted inconsistencies in the quality of information provided to local elected members to enable them to conduct that kind of scrutiny. So therefore, do you see that there are measures in place, particularly with the establishment of the single service, that there will be a consistency of information and data provided to local boards, local councillors, to enable them to engage much more effectively in their scrutiny role?
Can I take a longer run at that question in my response, in the sense that I think one of the points we've made several times in the individual reports is that it's not just that the members are not provided with the information so they can't scrutinise. It's also that they should know to ask for information, almost the daft laddie and daft lassie questions, because almost inevitably these are quite piercing questions that get right through to the nub of things. And that's part of it, that they're not as ill-equipped as some of them may think they are. And if they don't have an answer to the question, they should be asking, why is that not in the regular scrutiny package? Why is that not the regular information I get? The other aspect of it that you asked, and maybe ask Martin to respond to that.
I think, sorry, was interesting that during the course of the audits, because in contrast to the fire audits, which were done over a relatively short time frame, this sequence of audits, if you like, started in 2009. We did the first report, so it covers a longer time period. One of the things that's interesting that we comment on the report is that the quality of performance reporting and performance information we actually saw improve as we went around the audits. Now, we might like to think that part of that was because we were publishing some of these findings in the audits, that other forces were sort of picking up on that and choosing to make some changes. Here's hoping that's what part of what audit's supposed to be about. The thing for me, which is very, I think, relevant to a lot of this discussion this morning, and echoing John's point just there, is around a clear understanding on the part of members, the role and responsibility. And I think one of the points that we make in the report is that, to a degree, in many boards, there's a fairly passive relationship that there's been between the board and the Chief Constable. So there will be scrutiny of what information has been presented to the board, but not as much of what John was describing there, which is the board actually asking for particular bits of information. Now, I think it's possible to track that back to a clear understanding on the part of members of what the roles and responsibilities are, in them understanding that it's entirely fitting and appropriate that that is part of their role. And so I think to a degree it was that the boards have got into a way of doing things. It's being, you get these kind of reports at this frequency, covering these kind of areas, and possibly collectively almost forgotten that they do have the powers and indeed the responsibilities to ask for and determine what kinds of information that you get, which puts them in a much better position to do the scrutiny, which is part of their responsibility as a board. I think in terms of themes of what that performance information looks like, one of the things that did come through quite regularly in the audit work was the use of comparative information. So what we found is that boards would typically get information that would come to them which would present the latest performance information. In the better reports, it would present that performance information compared to last year or compared to the last quarter, that kind of stuff, but didn't always necessarily present that information and also make a comparison between that and the Scottish average, or that and another force that is similar to those. So again, at the risk of sounding like we keep beating the same drum all the time, I think there is issues there around providing members with the level of performance information that they reasonably ought to expect for them to be able to ask the kind of questions, the daft laddie questions, the daft lassie questions that John mentioned. So I think there is an area there that can be developed, and I think with looking at it from a national perspective, that will mean that there's a better opportunity perhaps for, in the first instance, for the board members, whether it be locally or nationally, to really understand the roles and responsibilities, and from that then set their expectations in terms of the kind of performance information that they need to fulfil that role effectively.
That's very, very, very helpful. I mean, most councillors I know, certainly in East Ayrshire, are not slow at coming forward. And I mean, I have to ask you this then, though. I mean, is there more of a focus then on the kind of strategic nature of scrutiny being rolled out in the local authorities for our local councillors, so that they can step in and ask the daft laddie questions, but really engage in the strategic issues that are really very important for the future as it moves forward, for the service as it moves forward?
We've been encouraging councillors on all manner of fronts to try to take a strategic role, the corporate strategic role, and sometimes they do and other times they don't. That's where it starts. And I think sometimes councillors may be knocked back when it comes to such things as policing activities by the debate that's been there forever between strategic and operational, and perhaps have accepted too readily. And I think Martin's just touched on this, that it's an operational. The answer is it's operational, so it's none of your business now, obviously, simplifying. I think perhaps there's been less thorough challenge of that kind of response. The other thing is, I was just looking at paragraph 70 of a report, and if I may just read 2 sentences of it. It says, we found in only a minority of police authorities that members had influenced the type and quality of performance information they received to allow them to determine whether the force is delivering on strategic objectives. So that's the general point. That there is evidence there that it's only a minority that are actually saying that that's maybe what you provided me with, but actually what I want is something different.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all our witnesses, particularly Mr Bailey, who's taken part in both sessions. I think that we should, in closing, note that this was by way of a transitional session, because next year the reports both in the fire service and the police will come to us or be done by the Auditor General and be laid with us. And I wonder, therefore, if we could perhaps do two things, or we could do one thing and perhaps ask the Accounts Commission to do the other. We can, I think, send the official report of today to the Auditor General just to draw our attention to the points that we've made and have been made by witnesses about things which will be important to get right in the new setup. But there is also a practice in the Parliament, when a Parliament ends, for a committee to write a legacy paper for their successor committee. And I wonder if that kind of a document might be quite a useful one, perhaps, to ask the Accounts Commission to prepare. Not a lengthy document, but something which summarises from their experience of doing these best value reports what they think are the key things which it will be important to get right or even get better when we come to looking at the audit of the national forces.
To accept the general principle of that and perhaps discuss the detail offline. One immediate response, but just in the meantime, is that both reports have an appendix. I think in both cases it's Appendix 2 that talks about key issues for the police service and the new SPA to address, and likewise the fire service. And the interesting thing about this, when I was rereading these reports, was at every point, and sorry, this sounds like an adverb, but it's not meant to, every point in there is a substantive point. I mean, there's a big agenda for both new boards to get underway with, and it's going to take more than 10 minutes to sort it.
I think that's a very fair comment, and I think that those tables in the reports are the starting point for something, but I thought it might be interesting to give you the opportunity to perhaps elaborate a little on,
happy to contribute,
on some of them for our benefit when we look at a year from now, I guess, at what's happening. Okay, thank you very much. Do members want to press on, or do you want a comfort break? Just keep going, I think. Quick. Okay, well, we could do just 2 minutes, yeah? 2-minute break. reconvene. We are in public session again, and item 5 on our agenda is the Major Capital Projects Report. So this is the 6-monthly update which we get from the Scottish Government. It's been circulated to members. It now includes, I think, all the things we've asked for: community benefits, an indication of changes, and information on the NPD, the hub programme. That's all there. So I'll just open this up to colleagues if anyone has anything they want to raise. Shall we just note this report then? Can we note that? Agreed? Thank you very much. Item 6 is also from the Scottish Government. This is an update also, this time on the Section 23 report we received, planning for the Commonwealth Games, a progress report, and essentially this is an update. In fairness, around an area we had raised some concerns about, which was, or some questions around security. And it tells us, as I think we will probably already know, that the budget for security has been increased. Anybody want to raise anything on this? Mr. Griffin.
Chair, yeah. I think we recognise as a committee that the security budget would go up and down. I don't have any concerns about the budget going up. It was raised in the debate in the Chamber about the audit and scrutiny of the additional funds that are coming from government, £37.7 million, and it was just a question over who would scrutinise that spending, as it seems to be within the Minister and the First Minister's gift at the moment. The other question I would have would be that all of the money in the contingency budget seems to be getting swallowed up into the security budget now. And Audit Scotland themselves raised concerns about a couple of the aspects of the games which will be running very close to the opening ceremony, and if there are any additional funds needed there, I have a concern that all the money will be swallowed up into the security budget.
Okay, so that's. I mean, the only thing we could do, I guess, would be to write back in response to this and ask those questions. So that would be what, I mean, we are the Audit Committee, so it doesn't seem unreasonable to ask where and how the additional funding or the security funding will be accounted for and audited. That seems fair enough. And your other question, Mr. Griffin, is what are the implications for other budgets if the whole contingency budget is devoted to security? Is that? Yeah. Can we agree to write and get an answer?
Do we know how much the contingency budget was?
Sorry?
Do we know how much the contingency was?
It says...
I know that how much it's
new budget will be funded by drawing 25.1 million. I wasn't there in the debate. I don't know if Mr. Griffin... Do you know how much the contingency budget was?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
Well, let's not ask... Yeah, we can ask what proportion of the contingency budget is that and what are the implications for other... Yeah, it's just information really, I think. Agreed? Yep. Thank you very much. We'll now move to private session, so ask any members of the public and they are to leave.